Hello everyone, and welcome to my tier list for the High Isles patch. This tier list is specifically about DPS in trials for PvE experiences. A couple adjustments since the last time I made a tier list. The Dragonite combustion passive has been nerfed, hurting their sustain considerably, and sorcerers had adjustments made to the crystal weapon spammable. It is no longer a spammable ability, where you activate it, use it, activate it, use it. It is now considered a semi-spammable ability, where you activate it, use two other skills, reactivate it, use two other skills. This has made large adjustments to the tier list, as well as an overall meta shift from the expectation that DPS should come to the trial with a certain amount of offensive penetration they are providing themselves, to now the meta being the group will provide the offensive penetration to the DPS. And what that ultimately means is that instead of having to come to the trial in light armor or having other sources of offensive penetration, DPS can now come to the trial wearing full medium armor, full offensive sets that don't involve offensive penetration. This means that instead of being in a Magicka meta, which is what we were previously, we have transitioned now to a stamina meta, where all of the DPS are more commonly wearing 5 or more pieces of medium armor for all fights. As a result, you're going to see the stamina classes in general get a bump up, and the Magicka classes get a bump down. Remember, meta and effectiveness is not an unlimited quantity. So in order for one thing to be effective, it has to be more effective than something else. So while Magicka classes are technically at equal strength to what they were before this patch, you'll see them move down on the tier list because that effectiveness that they brought last patch is being eclipsed by more effective strategies this patch. If you are currently playing a Magicka and you do not want to change, you do not need to change. You are just as effective as last patch, unless you're Magdk. So, other considerations that we have to keep in mind. This tier list is made for more than just the top 5 groups in the game. It's meant to be applicable to teams that are still progressing content and not just score pushing or going for the hardest trifecta. Another consideration is that I, as a player, tend to highly value single target damage over cleave damage. Cleave is strong, and in certain fights it will be really flashy. It'll put you at the top of the DPS charts. But every class sort of has access to cleave, and in my experience, proper rotations and maintaining ground-based AoEs is generally enough cleave for most content. The preference for single target damage mostly impacts the position of sorcerers and nightblades, as they are primarily single target classes. So they may be higher on my tier list than you'll see on other tier lists because I like that single target damage. Templars sort of are single target as well, but they're often the class running as Zerblite, which gives them really good cleave damage in trash fights and certain boss fights. Another consideration is that I'm making this with progression groups in mind, so I'm going to put a little bit more value on unique buffs and debuffs that classes bring to a group, because I'm not making the assumption that the support will just take care of that. If the group needs a Nightblade, we'll just bring a Nightblade healer. I'm not making that assumption. If the group needs major vulnerability, I'm not just assuming, that will be covered by the tank with Nazare. As you move higher and higher up, those buffs become less and less important. So if it feels like I'm placing a class higher because of the unique buffs and debuffs that they can bring to the group, keep that in mind, that as you move through and do harder and harder content, those buffs become less and less valuable because the support will provide them, not the DPS. A last consideration needs to be made in terms of the naming that I'm going to use for the different classes. I'm going to refer to different classes as Mag and Stam, so a Magdk, a Stamdk, etc. When I say Mag or Stam, what I'm referring to is the allocation of a class's attribute points in the character sheet. So Stam characters will have 64 points into stamina, as well as all stamina enchantment glyphs on their armor. To give an example, I could be referring to a Stamcro, and a Stamcro is a character that has 64 points into stamina in their character sheet, all stamina enchantment glyphs, but that class might, in certain situations, be using spell damage glyphs on their jewelry and have more skills on their bar that use Magdk than use stamina. Or their main spammable is Magdk, even though I'm referring to them as stamina. Just to be clear so there's no confusion. Things can get a little bit ambiguous since the hybridization changes. Alright, with all that covered, let's get into the tier list. And we're starting off the tier list with Magdk. And this is one that I'm going to put in A tier. So, make no mistake, this class was hit hard by the combustion passive nerf, and it's bumped them down quite a bit. I've seen other lists or heard other perspectives that this class is potentially C tier. This class is potentially in the gutter now. For me, I'm not quite there. I still see a lot of value in the Magdk. Some of my bias might be due to player knowledge. With Magdks having been king in the previous patch, a lot of players are still playing them, and still playing them at a highly effective level. But beyond that, it's still a very good class. In a sub-optimized group, it can bring a lot of utility through igneous weapons, engulfing flames, stagger, and support sets like Zens. And as far as the sustain nerfs are concerned, last patch some Magdks were running without any points into the Battle Roar passive, which I've always considered to be class defining. This patch, those points are back in, and the class plays more around burst phases using Standard of Might and the resulting flood of resources to race through fights. It still has extremely strong cleave and single target damage. It's just they might have had to adapt their build in some way, shape, or form to account for worse sustain. I still think it's a very powerful class. If you enjoyed playing it, I see no reason to just dumpster it. Alright, next class to talk about. I think I'm just going to leave the Stamdk where it is for now. I'll talk about the Stamdk towards the end. Let's talk about the Stamblade. So, for me, the Stamblade is... I'm going to put it in A tier. The Stamblade has really grown on me here recently. It's a single target class primarily, and it has a difficult and dynamic rotation. There's been metas in the past where, the meme, the common joke amongst the endgame community was, hee hee ha ha, who cares about cleave? Nowadays, it seems like we have the opposite. And as the pendulum kind of swung from that emphasis on single target damage, it's like it just clobbered Nightblades right in the face and just swung them out of the meta. I still think that single target damage is really valuable, but maybe less so. They keep making newer trials that tend to have a large cleave component to them. Kyne's Aegis, Rockgrove, now Dreadsail Reef. All of these trials tend to reward cleave damage with higher numbers on the DPS charts for sure, and a lot of them have dangerous enemies that need to get cleaved down or focused, and then that cleave damage that you're dealing will bounce and hit the boss as well, increasing your single target damage on the boss. So, as far as Stamblades are concerned, they've benefited quite a bit from hybridization. They were given access to the Magbow, Merciless Resolve in place of Relentless Focus. They've been given Twisting Path and Dark Shade, and all three of these are really powerful abilities. Stamblade also has a certain amount of flexibility. In certain situations, they can flex Swallow Soul onto their bar and have access to a powerful self-heal that also deals good damage. Now, for some of the negatives, this is a crit class, which means that previously it had one of the best passives in the game, 10% more crit damage. However, nowadays that extra crit damage is less important. It's not a detriment, but most groups aren't building around classes dealing 10% more crit damage. And so the group is catered more towards classes that don't have that crit damage bonus versus classes that do. So Stamblade suffers a little bit in that regard. Couple that issue with the low cleave that this class has, and you kind of end up with a weaker version of some of the other classes that I'll talk about later. As far as group buffs are concerned, this class provides minor savagery, which can be really good if other members of the group are running weapon power potions and they don't have access to Camo Hunter or Inner Light to pair with a Sorcerer as an alternative to the minor major savagery combination. Alright, next up we have the Magblade. And for me, oh goodness, the Magblade. I'm gonna put the Magblade in B tier. There might be some copium involved in this. Magblade is my favorite class. I've mained Magblade for a really long time, and a large part of me right now believes that they belong in C tier, but copium, they're still pretty good in VAS, and that's about the extent of it. They're good in utility roles. They can go into the portal in VSS. They can go into the portal in VCR. They have good self-healing and survivability, but their single target damage can be beaten by some of the classes that also have good cleave damage, and their cleave damage is one of, if not the worst cleave damage in the game. The thing about Magblade is they were really taken down a notch with the crit damage cap, and they haven't really recovered since then. A lot of patches, while they never nerfed the Magblade, they've been buffing other classes and kind of raising the floor around the Magblade. And for a class with such a difficult rotation that's reliant on light attacks, you don't get as much reward as you used to. For me, the class still has some of the best range damage, and the fact that it has such easy access to self-healing can make it new player friendly. But again, the light attack reliance and the fact that it has a difficult rotation makes it hard to recommend to a new player. And similar to Stamblade, it provides minor savagery, and that's kind of important to certain groups. But in some groups, they want minor savagery, but they don't want an actual Nightblade DPS, and they'll just swap it over to a Nightblade healer. You know your class is in a rough place when, instead of being slotted as a DPS, the support is being adapted to take its place. I'm still going to leave it in B tier because we could maybe call this the believe tier. I believe in Magblade. But yeah, their single target damage is decent. Their cleave is very weak. They're good in specific fights, and that's about all they have going for them, is those very specific fights, those specific roles where they can really excel. All right, talking about Magcro next. So the Magcro, I think I gotta put it in A tier. The Magcro and the Magdk were probably, they were close last patch. The Magdk got taken down a notch, and I think this works. In some ways, the Magcro is probably better than the Magdk now, but there's a big issue with the Magcro in that Stamcros exist. and we'll talk about Stamcros next, but for the Magcro, they're in a really weird place right now because their playstyle is almost identical to that of Stamcros, except that they have their attributes in what some people might say is the wrong place. They're going to have 64 points into mag. They're going to have mag enchants on their armor. And they're going to use a different spammable when choosing to use a spammable rotation over a pure dot rotation. And this kind of comes as a result. Necromancers have some of the best sustain in the game right now. And so whether they put all their points into stamina or whether they put all of their points into Magdk, whether they wear light armor, whether they wear medium armor, they're going to have good sustain. So Magcros have great sustain, decent damage, but it's hard to put them super high up in A tier or into S tier when realistically most groups are going to be looking for Stamcros instead. The one thing that Magcros tend to have over Stamcros, though, is Magcros can run EC when Stamina Necromancers cannot. And so being able to run EC, some fights they'll run Master Architect as well, and the Colossus. They can provide a lot of group utility buffs that Stamcros cannot. Now, let's talk about Stamcros. And this one might be long-winded. Stamcros are easily S tier. A very, very powerful class right now. They were in a good spot previously. It's just that no group wanted to run the penetration sets that they really needed in order to excel. But now that the group is providing the penetration, they're just going to the moon in terms of effectiveness. They're in a really good spot right now. The hybridization changes was really good for them because it gave them access to the Magicka version of Blast Bones, which deals more damage and significantly helps their sustain. Because now every third ability, they're going to cast a Magicka costing ability, which cuts their stamina use by a third, potentially. So it has the best sustain of any DPS class right now, and it can utilize a lot of different food options as a result of that. And because of the hybridization changes, groups and the buffs and the food and the potions and the jewelry enchants and all the things that DPS have to run and potentially switch around from group to group to group, Stamcros are probably the least affected. They can run max stamina, Magicka recovery food if they need to run weapon power pots. They can run parse food, stamina and stamina recovery food if the fight is really stamina intensive. They can run max health, max stamina food if the fight isn't super resource intensive and they need a little bit more survivability. That flexibility is so good, coupled with the fact that they are insane when it comes to damage. They deal probably the most cleave damage. Other cleave classes aren't really played nearly as much as them because other cleave classes cannot come anywhere near their level of sustain or flexibility. So they're doing really good cleave damage. They have really good single target damage to combine with that cleave damage. And they're super flexible. You can have a Stamcro run Alkosh. You can have a Stamcro run the Colossus if you need more major vulnerability. They can, as I've said, they can alternate their food. This adaptability in combination with the raw damage just puts them easily in S tier. I highly recommend picking one up if you're looking for a new class to try out for this patch, or if you're already very good at a Stamcro and you've been wanting to play the class, now's the time. I think that's all I have for Stamcro. It's an amazing class, S tier right now. Very, very hard to beat. I haven't been playing too much Stamcro this patch. I've played it at the very start just to get a baseline of how powerful it is. And it's a very powerful class. It's hard to beat when it comes to raw DPS. All right, next up we have our Magsorc. And the Magsorc for me goes in the belief tier. I believe in Magsorc. I think it's ahead of Magblade. I can definitely find, the Magblade, I got to take some copium. I got to talk about Vass in order to justify Magblade's position and not just throw it, in a lower tier. Magsorc, though, Magsorc's got a little something something. There's something there. I have a very, very strong parse on Magsorc right now on Tideborn Teleria, and that's kind of like it's my strong tower in the middle of the battle, right? I'm leaning on it a little bit, hoping that Magsorc has some potential. So, as you can probably tell, I'm really enjoying playing the Sorcerer in PvE right now. Magsorc is no exception to this. I've been playing the class extensively in VCR, and then somewhat in VDSR. I've had good results in both trials, and seeing as that these trials are so different, VCR being a mini trial with an emphasis on burst windows, lower cleave, and range damage, and then VDSR being a full trial with more of an emphasis on consistent damage, cleave, and more melee-oriented damage. Since I've seen it be effective in both of these trials, it's easy to say it feels good to play, and there's a lot of potential. The biggest issue that I have with the Magsorc, it's kind of similar to the Magcro, is Stamsorcs exist. And Magsorcs are very single target reliant. The general community perception of single target versus cleave damage is that they want more cleave damage than single target damage. And then Magsorcs are in a weird place too, because their armor preference is light armor, as it is with most mag classes. They technically want to wear light armor more. They can wear medium armor, but if they are wearing light armor, they're going to want to utilize the really strong stamina abilities that sorcerers have. They're going to want to use stuff like Crystal Weapon. They're going to want to use stuff like Bound Ornaments, to some extent Hurricane. And when you're leaning so heavily into these stamina costing skills, your Magicka sustain becomes really, really good. And the best light armor set right now is Basai, which needs your Magicka to be low. So not only has light armor kind of fallen out of favor, but Basai in particular isn't that good on Magsorcs because they're trying to lean into their stamina abilities to do more damage, which means that their Magicka stays higher, so they do less damage with Basai. It's kind of a feels bad, man. They're in an awkward spot. And if they're going medium armor and they're leaning heavily into their stamina skills, why wouldn't they just become stamina sorcerers? As far as group utility is concerned, they bring Minor Prophecy to the group, which is pretty decent. I know a lot of Stamcros right now, they like to use spell power potions when they are doing their rotation because the Magicka cost of Blast Bones, as well as something like Orb or other Magicka skills, they are more Magicka intensive than they are stamina intensive, and so they'll run spell power potions, and that gives them Major Prophecy, which they want to pair with the Sorc's Minor Prophecy. So Sorcs also get a bump up. Man, I'm almost talking myself into A. I think I'm going to stay with B, but Sorcs get a bump up because that Minor Prophecy is so important to the meta class of Stamcro. Alright, so next up we have Stamsorc, and this is going to help clarify why Magsorc is in B tier. Similar to Stamcro bumping Magcro down to A tier, Stamsorc is just so strong and so good that I feel like Magsorc is the little brother living in the shadow. It's hard for Magsorc to be emphasized in a meta where Stamsorcs are extremely emphasized. So let's talk about Stamsorc. So Stamsorc I'm going to talk a lot about because it's my favorite class on the patch, and I've been really, really enjoying playing it, and I've had some of my best parses of all time with Stamsorc. So Stamsorc received a huge buff going into High Isle. I touched on it earlier. Their Crystal Weapon spammable, quote unquote, was changed into a semi-spammable. So instead of it having to be cast and then used and cast and used, now it can be cast and then 2 skills can be cast and then it can be recast. This raised the damage of the ability a lot. I don't believe that they nerfed its per hit damage. They just made it hit 3 more times. So in a way, it's like casting 3 spammables for the cost of 1. It's a really, really strong ability now. And it also lets them keep up their dots super, super consistently. And the mechanics of using Crystal Weapon as a semi-spammable, I just really like. I like how it interacts with fights and how it's used. So, for instance, let's say you're playing a Stamcro and you cast Blast Bones and the boss moves away from you. The time it takes for your Blast Bones to go off has changed now from that 1.5 seconds to now 2.5 seconds. And this hurts your rotation a lot because the next time you want to cast Blast Bones, the last one you cast won't have blown up yet. It makes your rotation awkward and clunky. It's really, really annoying. And that's a problem with Blast Bones. The other semi-spammable, most commonly noted, is for the Warden with Shulks. And for Wardens, let's say the boss moves away from them, now the Shulks go off and they don't hit the boss. Okay? Similarly, for both of these spammables, if you cast the spammable and then the enemy dies in, let's say, 1.25 seconds, you're not going to get the damage for that cast. It's essentially a wasted cast. Now let's talk about Crystal Weapon. Crystal Weapon buffs your light attacks. And at any given time, at a high level of DPS, you want to be light attacking the boss as much as possible. And it's a lot harder for a boss to avoid your light attacks than it is for a boss to avoid something like Warden Shulks or to move away from a Necromancer's Blast Bones. So this spammable, it's more consistent, or excuse me, this semi-spammable is more consistent than these other 2 semi-spammables. It's really good. And even let's say the boss moves away and you might miss a light attack. That doesn't matter because you can still recast Crystal Weapon at the same time in your rotation. It doesn't have to adapt or get clunky like the Stamcros does. Couple that with the fact that Sorcs, single target wise, in my experience, and I also believe from what I've seen on the logs, they're beating the Stamcros in single target damage. Obviously, skill has a lot to do with performance at this level of the game. If the Sorc misses a light attack or 2, messes up its rotation, the Stamcro can win. Same thing the other way around. But Stamsorcs, they can just go bonkers. Absolutely crazy class in certain circumstances. Yeah, they're really, really good. I got more to say. So not only is Crystal Weapon an awesome semi-spammable, it also provides 100 armor shred, which is really, really valuable in the new Stam meta. That 100 armor shred is, 1 less debuff set that the support have to wear. It's 1 less area where the DPS have to spec for penetration. So not only is it good in the fact that it just does a ton of damage, it also provides something to the group. Every time you activate it, and you can pre-buff it, every time you activate Crystal Weapon, you're giving the group minor sorcery, which means that not only do they provide the same buff as magic sorcerers, since they can pre-buff it, they're technically giving better uptime on the buff. Alright, let's talk about the limitations though, because there is a reason. I feel like I'm talking it up and everyone might be wondering why it's not ahead of the Stamcro. All of its damage, well, most of its damage is single target. It's a very single target oriented class. Crystal Weapons is not an AoE spammable. What it gains in consistency, it loses for not being AoE. Blast Bones shulks. These are abilities that are going to deal really, really crazy amounts of damage in fights with multiple people in it. Crystal weapons, not the same case. Now, other things that it suffer from is, in order to do these high levels of DPS, the Stamina Sorcerer has a very rigid build. It's not very flexible. They need parse food. They need weapon power pots. They cannot really flex out of those. They need to run the pets, so that's 4 skill slots allocated to pets alone. Because they have the pets, they also want to run Daedric Prey, so that's a 5th skill. If they're running Crystal Weapon, which they should be, it's the best semi-spammable in the game for single target right now. So they're running Crystal Weapon, which means they're light attacking often, which means they want Bound Ornaments to buff light attack damage by 10%. So now we're up to 7 skills. Then they're going to want to run Two-Hander, so they get access to Stampede and Cleave, which puts us up to 9 skills. So they have 9 skills that are very rigid. This is the structure of the Stamsorc. 9 skills that are extremely rigid. And in these 9 skills, they don't have a minor force buff. So that 10th skill really wants to be Trap. So now we have a class that is forced to run weapon power potions, forced to run parse food, and basically all 10 of its ability slots have to be the same specific abilities. Otherwise, it can suffer from really big DPS losses. Now, I really like to run Zogvins, which frees up the barbed trap slot for a flex spot. Most often I'll run Hurricane in that flex spot. But depending on what you're being asked to do, if you have to go into VCR portals or VSS portals or the toilet in VDSR, your build is going to have to undergo some adaptations, and these adaptations can really significantly drop your damage in a way that Stamcros don't have to make the same level of sacrifice. You know, they can drop 1 skill versus, Stamsorcs might have to drop a pet. They might have to drop a skill that is fundamental to how much damage they're doing. They're very, very rigid. But when they work, they work. They are extremely good, really consistent. I like playing the class. They got pretty good survivability. Every time that you proc Crystal Weapon, you're going to get healed. So they have, if you're running Hurricane, you have your minor or your major resistances at all times. If you're running Crystal Weapon, you got a consistent amount of healing coming in. It's a good class. It's consistent, good survivability, really insane single target damage. I've been loving playing it, and I believe it deserves S tier. All right. Now we have the Magplar. And as we get into the Magplar, my first thoughts are, I'm sorry, Magplars. I respect Magplars, but I also don't really like this class all that much, and I think they're in a weak spot. It's my first C tier class. Here's the thing. To play Templar effectively, you need to learn how to light attack weave jabs properly and do something called fast jabbing. Now, the problem with that is fast jabbing is really hard to learn, and it's somewhat different from learning how to weave on all of the other classes. So it's hard to recommend the class to new players because I'm afraid they're going to learn one of 2 bad habits. They're either going to learn how to improperly light attack weave with jabs, or they're going to not light attack weave at all. But that's irrelevant to where they rank in the trials. Magplars are a crit class. They're particularly single target. They can flex into a set like Azure Blight, and this gives them good cleave. Running Ritual of Retribution is really good cleave if it gets all of its ticks. But there's limitations. Jabs is not as big of an AoE or as much cleave damage as something like Blast Bones or Shulks. Only one person can run a Zerblight, and it's not always going to be the Templar, and a lot of other classes can run it just as effectively. So if you don't have a Templar, you can still run a Zerblight and do really well. Like I said, it's a crit class. And the other thing to keep in mind about Templars is last patch, they ranked decently, but a huge portion of why they ranked so well had to do with the vampire toggle. The vampire toggle has since been nerfed, and the nerf to vampire toggle was to Magplars what the crit damage cap was to Magblades. Essentially, a nail in the coffin. The class also kind of suffers from the same phenomenon as, Magsorc. A lot of the agency, a lot of the good things about Magsorc came down because Stamsorc got so good. A lot of the good things about Magcro and what Magcro could bring to the table, those were taken down because now Stamcro exists. Magplar is in the same way, but to like the 1000th degree. Magplar is an absolute shadow of Stamplar. Stamplar basically took all of the best skills from Magplar and uses them better. Magplar, with that being said, I still think Magplar is fun to play, especially in 4-man content. It's nice to be super survivable. Jabs is a really satisfying skill to use. It feels impactful. And in the shorter fights, Magplars can really excel where it isn't as taxing on their resources. In 4-man content, they can use False Gods, Acuity. These are setups that help sustain, help damage, really play into the Magplar's strengths. But in Trials, the sustain is going to be rough. You don't have the Vampire toggle anymore to really amplify your damage up to the levels of the big dogs. And other abilities, Ritual of Retribution, you can't sustain it if you run it, and it's one of your strongest abilities. There's a lot of issues with Magplar right now. Groups aren't really playing around the fact that they have extra crit damage. They don't have the Vampire toggle. Classes don't really want to wear light armor right now, and if you go medium armor on a Templar, your sustain is going to be really, really rough. It's a C tier class. It's struggling. Stamplar, on the other hand, I think it goes right there. I think Stamplar is reasonable right now, if not really strong. So Stamplar is a class that benefited a lot from the hybridization changes, especially compared to Magplar. Stamplar got Jesus Beam. It can run Ritual of Retribution and actually sustain it. It can use the Mag Shards now. And it can also use a lot of other Mag abilities. Orb. It can use the Mage's Guild Rune. All of these sources of damage from Magicka abilities, they work twofold. One, they increase the damage in general because they are better abilities than Stam alternatives. Two, they also help the Stamplar sustain significantly because it's casting Magicka skills when otherwise it would have been casting stamina skills. So it can sustain the mag skills, and because it's using the mag skills, it's letting it also sustain the stam skills. It's in a really good spot. It can use a Zerblight really effectively. Same thing as a Magplar. And something I forgot to mention with the Magplar, but is also worth mentioning with the Stamplar, they both can provide the group with Minor Sorcery, which is reasonable. I've been in a lot of groups where the Stamcros want to run spell damage glyphs because that's what they have to run for parsing. They don't want to change it over and over again. They want to run spell damage potions instead of having to switch over to something like Candy Gesture to sustain their Magicka. There's a lot of situations where that passive comes in handy. And yeah, and their damage is good. They do good cleave damage. Not as much as something like a Stamcro or a Stamden, but it's still reasonable, especially with Zerblight. And you really only need one, but the one that you bring is fairly impactful. Good class just to bring one. I don't think you need a bunch of Stamplars. And I think that they'll actually be getting even stronger come next patch if some of the changes go through, because Jabs is such a strong spammable, and it's looking like next patch you get more spammables in your rotation. So, yeah, in a pretty healthy place, Stamplars. Magplars could use a little bit of help, though. C-tier classes, this is like, these classes need help. S-tier classes, it's like, all right, these classes are pretty good. Maybe a little, I don't know. I guess I don't want to say that they're unhealthy. Maybe we could bring other classes up to them instead of bringing these guys down. But they do a lot of damage. These classes do a lot of damage. What's next? Magden. Oh, Magden. Alright, so Magden is going in C tier. Magden is like, it's just a worse version of a bunch of other classes. It's worse than Magdk in that it doesn't bring anywhere near the same levels of utility, and it has similar levels of cleave damage, but potentially less single target. It can exploit off balance to do a lot of damage, but off balance as a mechanic hasn't been super reliable since they gave it a cooldown. So while there's potential to deal a bunch of single target damage, I don't know that that potential comes close to like a Stamsorc. And while it deals a lot of cleave damage, Stamcros still exist and don't need off balance. Magden is just, it's in a rough place. Yeah, so it's a worse version of Magdk for utility and cleave. It's worse than Stamcro in terms of sustain, damage, and cleave. Wardens are a crit class. They get 10% more crit damage against enemies that have recently been chilled. So groups aren't really building around the crit classes because these classes up here are so good. So, your top 3 classes all don't have the crit damage bonus. So groups are going to build around not having the crit damage bonus. So when you're a class that does have the crit damage bonus, it's not helping you as much as it used to. Its best source of group utility was Brittle. And with new sources of crit damage coming into the game, Brittle as a debuff is the first on the chopping block. So Brittle doesn't have a whole bunch to offer. A lot of groups I see, they just have tanks run double Ice Staff and keep up Brittle if they want Brittle. So Brittle is a pretty low value debuff. It might be higher value in a progression group where maybe not every source of critical damage is being optimized. But yeah, Magden's in a weak spot. I really like Magden. I find it to be an enjoyable alternative to some of the sweatier classes. It has a more consistent rotation, and I don't know, I like the RP with the bear, It's cool to have Smokey hanging around. Also, if I played on console, I'd probably like Magden a lot more because it can be really effective without a whole bunch of gear and skill swapping. If you run a Magden with Winter's Revenge and Force Pulse, it's going to do a lot of cleave damage. It's going to do a lot of single target damage. You can run like your single target gear setup with Force Pulse and have a really strong class in AoE fights. But yeah, it's when a class doesn't have much to offer outside of novelty, it probably belongs in C tier. And it's not like a Magblade where I can be like, well, it's good in Vass. There's not a lot of copium for it. It's not very good in the mini trials. It's not very good in the bigger trials. It has issues with sustain. It has issues with consistent single target damage. Yeah, it's not in a good spot. Next, I'm going to talk about Stamden. So, Stamden's pretty decent right now. Let me think. What would I do with Stamden? I think I would put Stamden right here. Yeah. Stamden, again, it's kind of off-balance reliant, just like the Magden is. But the thing about the Stamden is it's going to sustain better than the Magden because it's going to have more access to Magicka skills. Stuff like Winter's Revenge, Mage Rune, Orb. And it can kind of fit those skills into its build to help it sustain. It's going to want to run medium armor, which is the meta. And Stamsorc was already good. A lot of the Stam morphs are going to add more damage because of bleeds. And yeah, it's just in a decent spot right now. The biggest reason why it's almost bottom of A tier is because this class exists and Stamcros basically do everything that Wardens do, but better. They sustain better. They do just as much cleave damage. They can run Colossus and have more utility for the group. They're not reliant on off-balance burst windows like the Stamden is. But this class, in single target, this class can compare with the Stamsorc. It's really strong single target, but it's, again, off-balance reliant. And when you show up with a Stamden, most people are going to wonder why you didn't just bring a Stamcro. Sag. So, let's talk Stamdk. I feel like Stamdk is a rant. Stamdk I'm going to put in C tier. If I was to put a class in trash tier, it'd probably be Stamdk. I'm not going to put any classes in trash tier. I'll talk about that. But Stamdk, I never see the class, first of all. Everyone who plays it that I've talked to has said what they tried to do in gutting Magdk, they did 100-fold on Stamdk. Stamdks can't sustain. It hasn't been a relevant class for years, and it wants to use damage over time effects, but all of its best dots are like better used by the Magdk because the Magdk can take the Stamdk dots and sustain better as a result of taking them. It's also a class that suffers really bad from the support meta. Dragonite tanks have been meta support for ever since launch. And if you're going to have a Dragonite tank, you're not going to need the minor brutality that a Stam Dragonite or a Mag Dragonite would bring as an alternative. You don't need Stagger from this class. In fact, if you run Stagger and it's not on the tank, I think the Magdk does it. So like everything this class has to offer to the group is just offered better by either the tank or a Magdk. Jeez. So what else is there? In terms of damage, this is going to have less cleave. It's not going to do as much cleave damage as Crow, Warden, maybe even Stamplar. Certainly not Magdk. So it's going to do less cleave. I think it can still do like decent single target, but nothing like, Mr. Single Target, Stamsorc. Yeah, and the class is also, it has other issues too beyond just the typical stuff. The class is slow. It has no movement speed buffs. It's limited in terms of self-healing. The best heal that DKs have access to is Burning Embers, and no one runs that because Venom Claw exists. So, and I always thought like for 4-man, Cauterize was a decent skill, but you're not going to run Cauterize and give up Flames of Oblivion ever. So it's slow and it has limited access to self-healing. So when you're playing one, you're making yourself a liability. You know, if a group is trying to push score, you can't bring as much damage. If a group is trying a no death achievement, well, you're slow and you have limited self-healing, so you can't get out of AoEs, and even if you sit in them, you can't heal yourself through them. And then, you know, the other situation is a group that's going for its first clear of something. It has no clutch factor. There's no situation where, you know, the two healers are dead and the Stamdk gets the save. You can do that with something like corrosive armor, but if you have corrosive armor on your bar, you're doing less damage, and that's one of its biggest problems. Beyond the clutch factor is just the fact that it doesn't do enough damage. To me, the only merit really of playing Stamdk is you get to say that you're one of the 5 players left on the server still doing so. And I think, you know, if you're a player just trying to get into trials and you want to play a Stamdk, good luck, man. Groups are going to overlook you looking for people that are playing meta. Jeez. All right, so there's your tier list. We got Stamcro, Stamsorc. These are my 2 S tiers. My biggest recommendation is to get into Stamsorc. I love this class. I think it's fun. It's satisfying to play. It might be weird for some people to see it running like double pets, because for the longest time, pets were always associated with the Magicka Sorcerer because they only scaled with your max Magicka. But now the Stamsorc's using them. Yeah, A tier, again, this one is probably one of the most contentious placements. I still really like this class, but I know a lot of people believe it's been knocked down. If you look at, you know, ESO logs, you'll still see Magdk's crushing it in Rock Grove. They're crushing it in VCR. There's still a lot of situations where this class is really, really strong. This class, good class, benefited a lot from hybridization, left the Magplar in the dust. This class, tons of single target, potentially as much as even the Stamsorc. Brings a very important buff to the group in the form of minor savagery. This one, decent cleave, decent single target, but ultimately a worse version of this class. Ultimately, Magcro, worse version of this class, but this class can also run EC, which is why it doesn't, you know, get guttered like maybe Magsorc or Magblade do, in terms of, you know, this is just a worse version of this is just a worse version of this. Down here, these classes kind of need help. Magplar, I want them to be good. I know a lot of people that really like Magplars, but they're just weak in terms of they can't use the medium armor because they can't sustain. They can't even use their best abilities because they can't sustain. It's a little bit of a shame. Magden just doesn't do anything better than anything else and doesn't offer a lot of utility. Brittle is a weak debuff that is usually allocated to the support. Yeah. Novelty. I like playing them for the novelty. Stamdk needs help. It's needed help for a long time. I don't know. I don't know if it'll ever. It would be scary to see a Stamdk meta again. When you see Stamdks up here, oftentimes it's because it's a heavy attack meta, and I don't think a lot of people want to go back to a heavy attack meta. So, I don't know, this class needs help, but please don't buff heavy attacks because we don't want that to be meta. That's the tier list. I didn't put anybody in trash tier, and that was done on purpose. Someone might ask, well, why did you even include trash tier if you weren't going to put anything in it? It's because, you know, when talking about Stamdk is a perfect example. ESO, believe it or not, I think that ESO is a really great game. It has deep combat and huge opportunities for players to progress, improve their damage, and to showcase their achievements with any class, really. And with that in mind, in my opinion, the only classes that go in the trash tier are the ones who place them there themselves. So if you don't take the time to understand how a sorcerer works, you might place it in trash tier. If you don't take the time to understand the mechanics of Nightblade, you might place it in trash tier. But if you have a reasonable understanding of the mechanics of any of these classes, they can be played at an effective level all the way up until, I don't know, all the way up until, jeez. All these classes can clear 98.75, repeating, of course, percent of the content. And really my biggest recommendation as you leave this video is to find a class that you enjoy and stick with it until you are satisfied with your level of mastery. And then if/when you look for a new class, take this tier list into consideration. That's about all I had. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.